Hello. Today we will be talking about strategic leadership, and this is also one of the key topics in strategy implementation. Because to implement any kind of strategy, you definitely need someone who is championing the agenda. You need someone who is willing to introduce the changes to the organization. And this is the prerogative of strategic leaders. So we'll try to figure out how they are managing the process, who strategic leaders are, what kind of leadership approaches work for organizations in different circumstances, and all the areas surrounding the topic. So we'll introduce the concept. We'll talk about top management teams because in established organizations, it is very rarely the single individual who makes all the key decisions. It is typically a combination of individuals with skills, knowledge, and vision who may take the organization forward. We'll talk about managerial succession and specifically what happens when the strategic leader at the helm of the organization is about to be replaced and what kind of consequences that might have for the future direction of the organization. And we'll also talk a little bit about key strategic leadership actions just to make sure we are on the same page and you have a better understanding of the tasks of strategic leaders as they manage the companies through whatever challenges the organization faces. So first of all, on the definitional side, what even is strategic leadership? So typically by strategic leadership, we imply the ability to anticipate, envision, maintain flexibility, and empower others to create strategic change as necessary. So here we take into account both external and internal environment, because as you remember from the very early sessions in this course, strategic management is really about trying to align these two environments, internal and external, and guide the organization to sustainable competitive advantage. What do strategic leaders typically do? They definitely challenge the process. If there's any sort of challenge that the organization responds to, it typically comes from strategic leaders who recognize the changes in the external environment or that something needs to be done about the internal environment. So they are the visionaries that push the organization forward. Moreover, they inspire a shared vision. For the organization to move forward, it is essential that people generally sign up to that vision of the future that leaders suggest. So they have to instill this picture of the future into the followers. And that is a very important function of leadership. They enable others to act. They model the way, right? It is always easier to follow when you have someone basically showing you the path. So they do model the way and they encourage the heart, because without organizational culture, without people's heart being committed to the project, very little can be accomplished. So this is what leaders typically do. With respect to vision, and I know this is on the softer side of management, and some of you may not be comfortable talking about issues like organizational culture or organizational behavior, psychology, yet these things are very important. So vision is a mental image of a possible and desirable future state of the organization. You have to basically tell the people where you see the organization in the future, what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And that gives people a sense of belonging and a sense of common purpose, which is absolutely essential. It has to be ideal, so it communicates the standards of excellence. No one wants to set up a vision for the organization aimed at a mediocrity. You always try to emphasize something that is superior. You want the people to believe in something greater than themselves. And, this is what drives people typically. You want them to strive towards something that is not necessarily attainable, but it is kind of noble, and something they would be excited to go after. It also has to be unique. For the organization to have sustainable competitive advantage, some sort of differentiation is absolutely essential. So your vision has to be unique to your company. It cannot, you cannot really imitate someone else's vision of the future. We did talk a little bit about imitation in the past and how very many successful organizations actually imitate rather than innovate, but that has to do with specific products or technologies. Your vision has to be unique. That is important. And finally, it can be some common vision for the organization as a whole, or maybe it is a set of smaller unit-specific visions that you develop. There is nothing there that tells that every unit within the organization has to try to achieve the same goal. And again, in the States, there are many companies, especially diversified companies, that pursue very different strategies, ranging from cost leadership to differentiation. And there is very little in common that these two kinds of businesses have. So obviously, you try to create a unique vision for each of these subunits, yet typically there is something at the helm of the organization that brings it all together. Right? So even though those units may be pursuing very different visions, very different versions of the future, at some level, at the very top level of the organization, there has to be something that unifies them. So again, one of my favorite examples is the business that I don't really know if it exists in any way, shape, or form in other countries. There's a grocery store chain called Whole Foods. It's a very high-end place where you can get organic, natural items priced fairly high. It does have a very specific kind of clientele. That same company owns a different chain of stores that are absolutely cost leaders called Aldi. And this used to be a European company. It has made it into the United States. He is following the success of the same business model in Europe. You might have seen these stores if you traveled throughout European countries. The agenda there is very different. So the vision for this this chain of stores is very different. Yet at the helm, at the upper level of the organization, obviously, in both cases, you try to build a very successful chain with decent quality products that satisfies the needs of the customers, that establish some sort of leadership in the market. So, even though the visions of each specific unit are not necessarily reinforcing each other, there is still some commonality throughout the organization, and that is important. Now, the thing that we need to discuss is the difference between leading and managing. You will notice more than once that these terms are often used interchangeably. Yet leading and managing are not the same things. So at the most fundamental level, leading is one of the functions of management. So I don't remember if we discussed the functions of management at the very beginning, but typically people identify 4 specific functions that managers have: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. So leading is one of the 4 key functions of management. So in this sense, management is kind of like an umbrella term, and leading is just one part of that thing. When we talk about leadership, we also distinguish between 2 kinds: a supervisory leadership and a strategic leadership. So supervisory leadership is basically the behavior that provides guidance, support, and corrective feedback for day-to-day activities. So as the name implies, this is what supervisors typically do. With strategic leadership, we talk about behavior that gives purpose and meaning to organization. So this is a higher level construct, if you will. So it tries to envision the future for the organization, and it tries to create that positive future. And obviously, these are very different kinds of leadership, yet the label we use for those activities is the same. And this is where a lot of confusion stems from. So you have to be able to distinguish between supervisory leadership and strategic leadership. So in some sense, although again, this analogy is not perfect, the distinction between supervisory leadership and strategic leadership is typically quite similar to the distinction between management and entrepreneurship, right? So management refers to the day-to-day supervision, whereas entrepreneurship refers to creating something new, to creating this new vision that you will follow on throughout the years. So again, this comparison is not perfect. This is just meant to give you a sense for what the main distinction is between these two kinds of leadership. And obviously, leadership implies having followers. Without followers, there is really no leadership, right? You cannot be a leader of yourself, even though, yes, in some sense, we all do try to do that every now and then. And even with respect to followers, there is a difference between subordinates and followers. Subordinates are just the ones who are below you as a leader hierarchically. They basically have to do what you tell them to do, but it doesn't make them true followers in the original sense of the word. Followers are independent thinkers. They do sign up to your vision. They do remain committed to organizational goals. They are willing to tell the truth if something goes wrong, but they back you up, right? So they support you as a leader rather than simply follow the commands. And this, again, is a very critical distinction, and it is absolutely essential for the organization to have a strong cadre of followers. And there's a story I like sharing with my students about the importance of followership. So in the States, the way that the application process looks like for the MBA programs is fairly standard. So sometime, maybe December, January of the year before you're going to start your MBA program, you send in your application to several business schools that you consider attractive, where you would like to go. And typically there's an application form. So you list your grades from your undergraduates, you attach whatever standardized scores you need to attach, things like GMAT for the MBA, for international students, TOEFL, obviously, reference letters and all that. And you also attach your statement of purpose. And so typically, either in a statement of purpose or somewhere in the application forms, they ask you to write short essays to answer a specific question. And so the story goes that there was one lady who was applying to the MBA program, and as she was filling out the forms, there was a question: are you a leader? And it is obvious that as an MBA applicant, the expected answer is yes. And she was inclined to say yes, but she knew deep down in her heart that she was not a leader. She did not feel herself, being an effective leader. So she thought very hard about this question. She really struggled with it. And then she decided to basically say the truth. And she marked no on that application form item, send it in, and believe that she will never, ever hear from the school. To her amazement, a couple of months later, she receives a letter from the admission council at the MBA program congratulating her on being admitted, saying that, this year we had a great number of highly qualified applicants, and we felt it was absolutely essential for them to have at least one follower. So everybody else identified themselves as leader. She was the only one who checked the no box on that question. And the people who were admitting students to the MBA program decided it was important for the program to have at least one student who did not try necessarily to play in the leadership position at all times, who would be able to support others, to support future leaders. And on that grounds, she gained admission to the program. So for organizations, it is important to have both leaders and followers. And, if you are ever in a position where you have people reporting to you, where you have people under you, try to make sure you develop them as followers and do not just treat them as subordinates. That is essential. There are different perspectives on leadership. The one is sort of the traditional one, probably most similar to this notion of supervisory leadership, is the transactional leader. So these are the people who use legitimate reward and coercive power to give commands and exchange rewards for services. So basically, they tell you what to do. You do it well, you get rewarded. You do it poorly, you get some sort of punishment, and that's that. And this is not necessarily exciting, but this is very clear cut. It's black and white. It's very easy to work in an organization where leadership is of this nature. It does not necessarily stimulate your development as a professional or as a person. It does not necessarily prepare you to take on more responsibilities. But if this is not what you're after, working for a transactional leader is actually fairly easy. And there are many situations where transactional leadership is the preferred leadership style, where you do not necessarily seek input from employees, where you do not need them to display the followership and maybe challenge you as you try to lead the organization. So we'll get back to that later on today. There are also charismatic leaders. And these are people who are dominant, self-confident, convinced of the moral righteousness of their own beliefs. They're able to arouse a sense of excitement and adventure in their followers. So think about Elon Musk. He's definitely portrayed as a very charismatic leader. I don't know the extent to which this is his true self, or if this is something that he just chooses to show the world, but definitely his public stance, his public appearance is very much in line with this charismatic leadership approach. We also talk about transformational leaders, and these are the people who actually motivate others to transcend their personal leaders for the good of the group. So these are more of mentors and people who mean well, and they're not really interested in supervision. They're not interested in correcting your mistakes. They are interested in having you develop your own potential. And I think all of us are really lucky if we have met leaders like that at any point in our careers. I was fortunate enough to have several people of this nature. It's not necessarily easy to work with them, and sometimes their approaches are harsh, right? Because they wish you the best, they challenge you, they expect a lot of you, and you're not always ready to take on those responsibilities, but they support you throughout the process. They help you become better versions of yourselves. So it definitely takes a certain kind of individual. I do not know if transformational leadership can be learned. It's almost like you have to be born with it, which is very problematic for us as strategic managers, right? You cannot develop that feature in others. You simply have to find the individuals who already have it. But again, depending on the nature of the tasks that your organization faces, this may be a very effective and very impactful kind of leadership. And there is a distinction between authentic and pseudo-transformational leaders. Again, so some people know that this leadership style is effective and it helps generate a strong cadre of followers. You know, there is the saying, fake it till you make it. I don't know if this necessarily applies to transformational leadership. So, maybe you can develop it to some extent, but I think that you have to be born with it and not attain it through learning or practice or anything like that. And there are multiple leadership opportunities within the organization that can give you a chance to practice your own leadership approaches. So we may talk about bridge leaders, maybe there are different projects that require someone to temporarily take the helm at the project and lead others to successful completion. There's also notion of shared leadership. And this is a newer approach to leadership where leadership is effectively distributed within the organization. Lateral leadership and other things, please read your textbook. It can be instructive, but I don't necessarily want to spend more time on this right now. And talking about leaders and managers, they are a very important organizational resource because it is them who make important strategic decisions. It is them who implement strategies. And when they make those decisions, they exercise a lot of discretion, right? So often there are no right and wrong answers. They have to make choices. And how much leeway they have at instituting their own vision, at pushing their own agenda, depends on three groups of factors: external environmental factors, the characteristics of the organization itself, and characteristics of the manager. So for the external environment, you're obviously going to look at industry structure, rate of market growth, number and type of competitors. So basically all the things that we have discussed previously. For the organization part, you look at size, age, culture, availability of resources, and how employees interact. Some organizations may be less forgiving than others at having managers imposing their will on free-spirited employees. It could be that the nature of your organization requires people to exercise their own creativity and to basically be innovators. And if you try to manage them through supervisory leadership, that will not necessarily work. And then with respect to the manager himself or herself, how tolerant they are of ambiguity, how committed they are to the firm, and how much they desire certain strategic outcomes, their interpersonal skills, their aspirational levels, degree of self-confidence, all of that will affect how they display their leadership, how exactly they manage the organization. So you put two different individuals in the same organization, the outcomes of the leadership approach will be very different. You put the same individual in two different organizations, and again, the outcomes will be very different. So it is always the notion of fit between the organization, the environment, and the individual that produces the results. You cannot look at either of these three factors in isolation. You have to see how they all combine and what it means for this competitive advantage that the firm is likely to develop. And obviously, regardless of how talented or powerful those strategic leaders are, they do not do it alone. There's always this top management team that supports them in making their decisions. And top management team is typically composed of the key managers who are responsible for selecting and implementing the firm's strategy. So as a rule, we talk about the levels of vice president and up. So why do we emphasize teams so much? Why is it never just one visionary strategic leader? So, you look at Apple and Steve Jobs, and everybody was, kind of attributing Apple's success to just his personality. But in fact, he had a very strong team working for him. And after he died, right, it was one of his top management team members who replaced him and took the company to new heights. So top management team is essential. And it is essential for a number of reasons. So first of all, groups or teams are building blocks for organizational structure. We did talk about organizational structure last week. So those basic building blocks, and that it's never just one individual. Typically, when you have a team, it improves productivity and quality, and it reduces costs, sometimes through having multiple perspectives represented, sometimes just by sheer benefits, of scale and scope and whatnot. Having teams enhances speed, fosters innovation and change, and basically it's beneficial for the members as well, right? It helps you with the feedback, it helps you with learning, with satisfaction. So having a team is beneficial for the organization, but working in a team is also beneficial to the individuals who make it to the team. So it's this self-reinforcing mechanism that organizations should definitely consider and implement as much as they can. And a lot depend on how homogeneous or heterogeneous the team is, so how diverse team members are. That will explain the extent to which the firm is able to formulate a strategy, extent to which the firm is able to go after innovation, and basically it will have multiple impacts on the strategy that the company comes up with. And you basically do want to have some diversity on your top management team. You may think that it is beneficial to have people with similar backgrounds, right? They may understand each other easily. They probably would reach some decisions a lot faster than a heterogeneous group. And you can say that heterogeneous top management team may have difficulties functioning effectively. And when we talk about this heterogeneity, almost anything could be the basis for those difficulties. It could be functional differences, right? If you have a board that is, I don't know, that has manufacturing people, engineers, marketers, finance people, they're motivated by different things. They speak different languages. Their time horizon is different. So for them to reach a unanimous decision or even a majority decision may not be an easy task. So they could have difficulties functioning effectively. If it's gender diversity or maybe age diversity, again, people will have difficulties functioning effectively. So you have to manage teams to ensure you get all the benefits. You actually need to have some facilitator that, someone whose primary task it is to ensure the group functioning, team functioning, for it to be effective. But at the same time, it is typically those heterogeneous teams that are positively associated with innovation and strategic change. And it is typically this kind of diversity that encourages members to think outside the box, to look for solutions elsewhere, and to be more creative. So if you need a greater capacity for effective strategic leadership in formulating strategies, heterogeneous top management teams is what you want. And interestingly enough, whether or not your team is heterogeneous has major implications to what may happen to your firm if you go through managerial succession. Right? So managerial succession is basically, let's say you have a CEO who resigned, who retired, or who maybe was hired by another company or decided to create a venture of his own. So you definitely need to replace that CEO with someone else. Where does this new guy come from? And in principle, there are just two places you can go to for the new leader of the organization. You can search for the new leader inside the organization. So this would be internal managerial labor market. Or you can try to look outside of the organization and bring someone in with skills and vision that seem to make sense for the company. There are multiple benefits to using both these pools of talent for managerial succession. If you promote people from within, they definitely know the firm. They know the industry. They don't need the time to actually figure things out. They know. And in that Apple example, when Tim Cook was promoted to replace Steve Jobs, that was one of the reasons for why he started out so well. That person is also familiar with products, markets, technologies, operating procedures, and it is also important for the company morale. If you promote someone, if you bring in someone from the outside, the insiders, the internal people may feel they have no room for improvement, that they have reached what is called a glass ceiling, they cannot break through, and they may get discouraged. When you bring people from outside, on the other hand, they bring fresh perspectives. So sure, they may take their time to get familiar with the company, but at least they are not committed to the same pattern of thinking. They may see opportunities where your current top management team sees none. They may be aware of the trends that you guys do not see. So depending on what you need, you should consider either internal managerial market or external managerial market. And based on how your top management team looks like, going after internal or external candidates will have different consequences for the strategies of the firm. So if you promote the person from within the company and you have a very homogeneous top management team, then nothing is going to change. You're going to have a stable strategy. This is fine. Everyone knows what to expect. No changes of any kind should be expected. If you promote a person from within, but your top management team is heterogeneous, you will retain stability, but typically it means that some innovation will follow. Maybe not breakthrough, maybe not something major or radical, but some innovation will be introduced. When you bring in the person from the outside and you appoint that person as a CEO, and your top management team is homogeneous, so everybody is largely, the same, that is a very ambiguous situation. And what is likely to happen here is that your top management team will change as a result, because that new CEO will try to shake it up a bit, will try to maybe bring in his or her own people that he knows, that he trusts, will try to restructure the top layer of the organization. And then finally, if the CEO replacement comes from without the firm, if it's the external CEO and your top management team is heterogeneous, this is clearly a situation where there will be a strategic change. There's just no other outcome that could be expected. So depending on what your company needs, when it comes to managerial succession, you need to look at either inside the firm or outside the firm. And based on the characteristics of the top management team, you can foresee the outcomes that are likely to follow. Now, key strategic leadership actions. What do strategic leaders do? Well, first of all, they determine strategic direction. This sort of goes with the territory. That's almost expected. That there's not even much point talking about it. They also have to manage the firm's resource portfolio effectively. At the business level, we will be talking about resources, capabilities, and competencies. At the corporate level, they need to figure out which businesses to develop, which businesses to simply hold, and which businesses to divest. They have to reap synergies across businesses. They have to sustain an effective organizational culture and change it, modify it as necessary. Definitely emphasize ethical practices. And this is something, again, I would probably want to spend a few minutes on. Historically, I think as we were thinking about businesses, the notion of ethics and business were not seen as even belonging in the same group, in the same category. Right, so businesses were seen as, basically being greedy, trying to make their owners or shareholders wealthy, and that was that. The goal of business was seen as, not doing something good, but making the most money, which often called for unethical decisions. It turns out that in the long run, it actually pays for businesses to pursue ethical decision-making. And often it is the job of the new CEO or a replacement CEO to institute, to implement those ethical decision-making practices, because often CEOs leave their corporations because of some ethical concerns. It may or may not make the news, but the current situation is such that ethical decision making is expected. So this becomes almost like a force in the external environment that you have to cope with. So ethical decision making becomes a necessity. And you have to establish a balanced organizational culture where strategic controls and financial controls are both visible, where they both play a very important role. Again, this is not easy. This is easier said than done, right? There are all those forces that pull the company in opposite directions, and this is why strategic leadership is not easy. Now, with respect to those corporate level decisions that strategic leaders make, I'm sure you have seen this matrix in some of your other classes. If you haven't, this is known as a BCG matrix or Boston Consulting Group matrix. It basically is a very useful tool to make sense of the businesses you currently control and to decide which ones to keep, which ones to divest, and which ones to develop. Basically, it tells you that there are two factors you have to take into account: relative market share and market growth rate. So you would probably have some businesses where your current market share is low, but the market grows really fast. So those are question marks. You don't really know what's going to happen to those. And the rule of thumb is you want to invest in those to try to get as big a chunk of this market as you can, because it's growing, because by the time things stabilize, it may turn into a very important source of cash for the rest of your business units. So if your market share is high and market has a high level of growth, those are stars, right? So these would be the ones that help finance your business. These are the ones associated with your future. So those question marks, businesses and markets that grow fast, but where you do not have a sizable market share just yet, you want to move it to that star quadrant. There may also be businesses in markets where the growth rates are kind of low. Maybe they are past their prime. Maybe they just happen to be a slow cycle market, whatever the case might be, but you happen to control a big chunk of it. So those are cash cows. You do not necessarily need to invest much in having that business perform well, but you can milk it, you can harvest it, you can use the money derived from this specific line of business to invest it into question marks so that they become your next stars, right? So that gives you this dynamic perspective on what to do. And then finally, you have some businesses where the market doesn't grow and you don't really control much of it at all. So these are dogs, so-called dogs, and these are the ones that you want to divest. You want to sell them off to someone who sees value in them, because there could be companies for whom those businesses will create some synergies and they would be willing to pay, some non-trivial amount to get control over this line of business. So that's that. The important part of your managerial function is control. So again, remember, management is all about planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. So we talked about leadership, and now we'll talk about control. Basically, control is any process that directs the activities of individuals towards the achievement of organizational goals. So it goes hand in hand with planning. If you haven't planned anything, there's really nothing to control. If you're not controlling what you've planned, then there was no point planning, right? So they have to go hand in hand. And there are three kinds of control: bureaucratic control, market control, and clan control, also known as organizational culture. So with bureaucratic control, you basically use rules, regulations, and authority to guide performance. So you set performance standards, you measure performance, you compare it to standards, determine deviations, take corrective actions if needed, and rethink the standards if necessary. And the standards are the expected performance for a given goal, a target that establishes a desired performance level, motivates performance, and serves as a benchmark, right? So depending on, again, what kind of business you're in, if you have a secretary, then maybe you have standards for how fast the secretary should type. This many words per minute, this many mistakes are allowed, like that kind of stuff. If there's a manufacturing facility, then you have those productivity rates that so many units has to be manufactured within an hour with such and such defect rate, right? And if people sort of do it easily, maybe you make the standards a bit more challenging. If they have troubles following, you figure out why. You either loosen the standards, or you train your people better, or you reorganize the process. So there are different things that you do. The control cycle is, again, a fairly straightforward thing. First of all, you have to set those standards, right? Because basically, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. There has to be some measurements in place. So like for the secretarial job, this many words per minute. If you cannot specify what constitutes performance, you cannot really manage it at all. You have to measure performance. It's typically done through written reports, oral reports, or personal observations. You compare performance with the standards, and then you take corrective actions. So very, very straightforward, nothing complicated here at all. And so, right, we're still talking about bureaucratic control. There are three ways of organizing it. The first level is feed-forward control. So this is when you basically come up with processes, policies, procedures, and rules. This is when you explain to people what it is that they have to do. So the example I typically use here is when you're getting your driver's license. Right, the first thing you need to do is you have to study the traffic laws. You have to study things about your car, how to turn it on, where the emergency lights are, the parking brake, things of that nature. So this is a feed-forward control. Nothing yet happened, yet you have to invest in preparing yourself for the task at hand. Then there is a concurrent control. You start doing those activities and you have someone monitoring you as you perform those activities. So this is like taking driving lessons with the instructor. So you get the feedback right away. And that helps you improve your skills. It helps you improve your performance. It prepares you for what's coming next. And then finally, feedback control. So you're doing everything on your own. You know the standards. You've been through this concurrent control. You've got the feedback. So now it's your responsibility to do as you're expected. And then if you fail, if there are some deviations, there are definitely consequences. So in this driving license example, you start driving by yourself, you run the red lights, you get a ticket, you have to pay a fine. So that's the typical approaches to bureaucratic control. There are definitely downsides to bureaucratic control as well. First of all, it's too rigid. You cannot necessarily prescribe what's going to happen in all circumstances. There will necessarily be situations that are not regulated enough by those policies or procedure manuals or, whatever the case might be. You also have people who are very good at beating the system, who may use the rules to basically get whatever they want. So when we talked about organizational structures, we discussed the matrix organization and how easy it is for individuals within that matrix organization to game the system, to play one manager against the other, to basically use the rules against the organization itself to their own advantage. It even becomes something of a sport where, this becomes your motivation to cheat the system to get the most out of it. Sometimes people are just resistant to control. And that is unfortunate, but psychologically, it is fairly easy to understand. Right? So when I do my teaching, I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable if people would come to observe how I do that. Not because, I don't know my stuff, But simply, having this extra factor there would possibly make me question myself every time I'm about to say something that, could have profound implications for you guys. And obviously, there are ways to overcome those challenges, establishing valid performance standards, providing adequate information, maintaining open communication, and all of those other things. So that's how you do bureaucratic control. Now, as I said, there are two other means to control individuals within organization. The one that is probably more interesting is the so-called clan control or organizational culture. Here, you don't even need to have a supervisor. You basically belong to a group that does things a certain way, and you comply with those ways and with those expectations because you feel yourself, you perceive yourself to be a part of the group. You do that because this is what's expected of you out of the sense of belonging, because you share those same values and you cannot let your friends, your partners down. It is a much softer way to control, but in many ways, it is far, far more effective than just a bureaucratic control, right? At least here, no one is trying to cheat the system. Here, people try to do something that is perceived by all of them as essential and important. And if both bureaucratic control and clan control fail, then you have market control, right? If you cannot really control your employees, if they do not perform as you expect, then the organization valuation goes down. Someone from the outside comes in and takes over your company. And they probably get rid of the top management. And they put their own individuals in charge. And they restructure the organization. And they reinstitute the organizational culture. And they set up their own standards and rules and procedures and policies and hope to take the company around. And there are businesses that actually have made a big name for themselves doing just that, right? Buying companies that are fat, dumb, and happy, as I think I gave you the example previously, and turning those around. So this only happens when bureaucratic control and clan control fail, but this is a very important tool to ensure that companies perform when the leaders, when their strategic leaders cannot lead the companies effectively. And I think here I will stop. So next week, we'll be talking about strategic entrepreneurship. But for now, I wish you the best in getting through strategic leadership and doing the cases and discussing it. It's a very interesting topic, even if it's a bit soft for some of you. So I hope many of you will find yourselves in a position of being a strategic leader later on in your careers, and know what kind of mistakes to try to avoid and what some of the best practices are. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.